Hi everyone! Today's talk is on the Neoclassical Age. Now, the Neoclassical Age usually is dated from the middle of the 17th century to the end of the 18th century. Now, sometimes it's divided into three subparts. Now, the first flowering of neoclassical literature is with the return of Charles II from France. Right? When Charles II is reinstated as King of England and Ireland and Scotland and Wales in 1660. Right? So he was in exile in France at the French court and came back to reign again. Right? As you know, his son Charles I was executed, and so then the Puritans reigned and the royalty was reinstated in 1660. And this is known as the Restoration period. Now, the Restoration is usually given as from 1660 to around 1700. Then you have what's called the Augustan Age. And the Augustan Age lasts from about 1700 to 1745. And these are quite loose dates, and these periods tend to overlap, of course. And the final part of the Neoclassical Age is usually called the Age of Johnson, referring to Samuel Johnson, the great lexicographer. Right? He had such an impact on the age that his frame of mind, his ideology, his way of writing, it was said to have had a huge influence on writers of the neoclassical period. Now, the Age of Johnson, you could say, begins with the death of Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift, two of the great neoclassical writers. Now, the Age of Johnson was influenced by this sort of literary salon called the Literary Club, a literary club that got together in a coffee house. Right? This was the great age of coffee houses. People gathered in these cafes around the city of London. And so this literary club had, many eminent men of letters and artists like Joshua Reynolds, Samuel Johnson, Oliver Goldsmith, and later Richard Sheridan, and quite a few others, less famous writers. So there are the three periods, the three subparts of the Neoclassical Age. Now, the whole of the Neoclassical Age is also sometimes referred to as the Augustan Age as well, right? So there's quite a lot of debate about nomenclature, how to call that period. But the Neoclassical Age is probably the best term in that it's not as narrow as the other three. So as you know, the Neoclassical Age, it's called that because it refers to this kind of second Renaissance, really, you could say, that developed mostly in France. And that's why the writers who were with Charles II at the court of the French king came back with French tastes, French models. So they influenced the literary scene by writing in that mode themselves, but also by encouraging others to write in that way as well. As you know, the French writers tended to be quite prescriptive in the way they thought that literature should be written, especially drama and poetry. And this academic, or the academicians of l'Académie Française were quite rigid. Others, like Corneille, weren't as rigid. His Le Cid broke quite a few of the neoclassical rules. But and the English writers who were influenced by French literature were mostly influenced by Molière. So you had a great flowering of Molière-like plays in the England of Charles II. This is known as Restoration drama. So that did tend to flower a lot. There were far more comedies than tragedies under the influence of Molière. So generally speaking, you could say that the neoclassical age in Britain was a little less prescriptive than it was in France, at least in practice, let's say. So now what Dryden did was he often rewrote authors of the past. He rewrote Shakespeare, Pope, Alexander Pope, rewrote Chaucer and John Donne. Now he rewrote them by versifying them, by adding rhymes that are more like full rhymes, and evening out the diction, getting rid of archaic words, and the iambic pentameter that they used tended to be smoother. Shakespeare often adds an extra beat at the end of his lines. There was none of that in the neoclassical period, right? Dryden all evened that out, so you would get, iambic pentameter would be 5 very even sets of 2 syllables, right? You know the iambic pentameter rhythm, it's da 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 da, right? So 5 of those 2-beat syllables, right? So you have an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, right? So the whole line had to finish on a stressed syllable. You couldn't have any of these Shakespearean additions of an extra unstressed syllable at the end or anything like that, right? So no irregularities. So that's what the neoclassical age was about, this kind of neat, tidy finish, this perfect varnish. They had to feel that there was a sense of formal finish. Right, so now they also translated a lot of the classics. Dryden most particularly translated Virgil, the Aeneid, some Ovid, some Juvenal. So it was a lot of the epics that were written in neoclassical age in England were actually translations. There are actually no real epics during the whole of the neoclassical period that were, serious epics that tried to rival the epics of antiquity. What you did have were parodies of, so mock heroic epics. They've tended to flower a lot, possibly because authors felt that the great writers of antiquity just couldn't be matched. Right? You couldn't rival the greatness of the Odyssey or the Iliad or the Aeneid. So the reflex was to go to parody. So it is a great age of epics, but mostly mock heroic epics. Even the novels, like Tom Jones, are modeled on epics and this epic breath, but they tend to be comic or comical epics. Just to give you a brief overview of the 3 arch genres, now the poetry that was written in the neoclassical age was all written in heroic couplets. Now a heroic couplet is a 2-line unit, right? You have a rhyme at the end, consecutive rhymes, and they have to be full rhymes, and they're written in iambic pentameter. right? Whereas the French had this kind of 12 lines, 12 syllable line. The English had a 10 syllable line, known as the Iambic Pentameter. The French 12 syllable line was called the Alexandrine. Now, the French tended to count every syllable. In England, we tended to count a group of 2, right? So 5 rather than 10, right? So these kind of units of 2 syllables following each other. So that tended to give poetry a very, very formal, very strongly rhythmical and strongly structured feel. Sometimes too much so, you might argue. But, you know, the great writers managed to make that sound rather smooth and natural all the same. It's been said that English naturally fits into the iambic pentameter. That's why it's the rhyming scheme that is, sorry, the meter that is used the most in English literature, because it's the meter that naturally English tends to fall in. You may not have noticed this, right, when you're speaking English, but it's this, you know, this continuous unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed sort of rhythm. Okay, so that's poetry. So the great poets were, well, Alexander Pope, to begin with. John Dryden wrote some poetry as well, but he was more of a dramatist. Alexander Pope was more of a poet, but he wrote poems in essay format. In other words, they're really essays that look like poetry. You know, and Voltaire was fascinated by Alexander Pope's essay on man. Right? It's called Essay on Man, so it has the kind of essay format, but it's actually formally written in verse. So Voltaire hailed this poem as the first great philosophical poem. And so Pope's Essay on Man tends to champion the values of the neoclassical age, but at the same time there are moments of satire. There are moments when he sees man in a very, not a very pessimistic light, but you know, in a very unidealized way. Right? He says that man, for example, is the glory, jest, and riddle of the world. Right? So that man is a divided creature, both glorious and ridiculous. Right? The glory, the jest, a kind of joke, and also a conundrum, a mystery. Right? Something unexplainable, a creature gifted with both reason and animal instincts. So man was seen as this unexplainable creature, but for the most part, you get the impression that man is totally understood. That the poet has managed to define man as this divided being, both full of wisdom and ignorance. So there's a great sense of antithesis in many of those neoclassical poems. This binary feeling that you have in the form, these heroic couplets, you also find thematically. So there are a number of antitheses that recur in these poems between, you know, nature and art, night and day, this kind of opposition between passion and reason, right? So these paradoxes are often resolved within the same couplet. That man is a kind of paradox, right? So it seemed ideally suited to explaining the ways of man. Now, so there is a strong stress on human limitations in a very unidealized way, a very objective way. Right? That's what the Neoclassicists sought to do. They wanted to attain a certain objectivity, whereas the Romantics that followed them were into subjectivity. Now subjectivity was seen as something you should try to get rid of. You should try to aim for absolute objectivity and reason and lucidity. And so the only salvation that Pope saw for man's fallen nature, right? They did believe in original sin, most of them, particularly Pope who had a Catholic perspective. Now the only way to reach salvation was to promote reason. Getting rid of the passions, tempering your emotions, that was the true aim of the great writer. This feeling also that you should submit to God's higher purpose and not question too many things. So there was no attempt to reach philosophical originality. It was all about acceptance. Most of the Neoclassicists felt that the great ideas, the great stories had all been told, had all been examined in antiquity, and that the only thing that a writer could do was to give it new shape. Right? That there were no new truths to discover. That all you could do was give it a pleasing shape, adapt the themes, the motifs, the stories of antiquity, and to the flavor of the day, and to make them feel contemporary. Right? So some of the classical stories were adapted to London society. They were set in London, for example. And so they were given a contemporary flavor. You had the feeling that these antique themes were happening in front of you in your home place. Right. So if the Romantics saw man as full of infinite possibilities, full of mystery, full of undiscovered, uncharted territory, the Neoclassicists, on the contrary, felt that everything had been said, that there was nothing new under the sun. Right, so a very different perspective. Now, the Neoclassicists were interested in behavior in general, right? Man's general behavior in society, whereas the Romantics were interested in a retreat from society and interested in man as an individual. What you get in most of the neoclassical poetry is an interest in the general ways of man's behavior. Now, they tended to flock to the cities. London was the place to go for writers, whereas the Romantics tended to flee the city. They went into remote areas in solitude. Neoclassical writers tended to socialize a lot, right? Like Voltaire, that kind of writer, right? Le Mondain, that idea of being a society man was very important, or a society lady. Samuel Johnson said to Boswell, when a man is tired of London, he is tired of life. Right, so just to show you how important the city was to the neoclassical mind frame. So there was this sense of public mindedness, right? That you should go to London to be of public service, and that your literature should speak to mankind in general, and therefore redeem man through literature. Literature was expected to teach you. It was didactic. It intended to entertain as well. Those were the two poles that an author should reach: entertainment and didacticism. Right, so the Neoclassicists tended to see the world in a very orderly fashion. The world was seen as one vast chain of being. Right, they inherited this image from the Renaissance. This feeling that everything was connected and that everything had its own proper place, its own order. You see this particularly in Pope's Windsor Forest, where everything is described as being in its proper place. This is very much linked to the neoclassical notion of decorum, that everything should be perfectly aligned and symmetrical. Right? He says in this poem that everything, even though things are various, that they are always connected and properly ordained. Right, so that's poetry. There was quite a lot of poetry written by Jonathan Swift as well, most of it satirical. He sometimes started his poems in a very idealized way, about the dawn, for example, but it quickly introduced noises of the city. Right, so Swift was always reaching for the low. Whenever he introduced the idealized, it would be leavened by references to the lowly. Okay, see you in the next video on drama and the novel.